Yay. Well, welcome to the Storytelling Association of California. We're a nonprofit membership organization, and we are dedicated to promoting storytelling as a living art form. So, this is our genre storytelling series. And on the third Wednesday of each month, storytellers from California's Storyteller Association of California affiliated swap groups come together to share stories. And each month features a different type of story or genre of story. And today's genre, tonight's, is sacred and inspirational stories. So our sacred storytellers come from up and down the state. We have Vinny Vijaya Kumar from Asian American Storytellers in Action, Betsy Mosier from South Coast Storytellers Guild, Ann Shimujima, also representing Asian American Storytellers in America, Ron Chick, representing Inland Valley Storytellers, Ben Tucker, who is from Contra Costa Tailspinners this evening, Catherine Bonin from Storytellers of San Diego, and Janice Burt, who is our guest storyteller. Our technician tonight is Prakrati Agrawal, and I'm your MC, Bowen Lee. I have got a spotlight on 6 Feet Apart, and so Prakriti will put that link if you want to check it out. And also I have a new story website, and I'd really appreciate it if you could take a look at it and tell me what you think. Give me some feedback on it. Anyway, without further ado, let's go to our first teller. And Winnie Vijaya Kumar is the vibrant essence of her mother country, India. She's got a passion for igniting curiosity in young minds, and she's traveled across India, captivating children with her storytelling. She's got a master's in communication and storytelling from East Tennessee State University, and she developed embodied storytelling there, a curriculum that integrates yoga and storytelling to enhance focus in 4 to 12-year-olds. Now, don't tell me they need focus. Pursuing her PhD in education at University of Nevada in Reno, currently, her publication, Weaving Emotional Acts into Online Education, Transforming Learning Through the Power of Narrative, details the seeds of her approaches to bringing life to online education. Winnie has an almost 3-year-old, and that's the reason why she is up first, because it's about bedtime. And at bedtime, Winnie's little girl loves Hanumanji stories. And here is a story called Jambavan, My Grandmother, Hanumanji, and I. So Winnie asks us to picture this. A mountain of research papers loomed before me, my literature review stuck at a standstill, until my grandmother, just like the wise old Jambavan did for Hanumanji, casually reminded me of the powers I had forgotten. Here's the story, the dash of divine inspiration from the Ramayana about Winnie's favorite half-man, half-god, Hanumanji.
Thank you, Bowen. So wonderful. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm so happy to share my favorite story of all time. It is, like Bowen said, about Hanumanji. Now, let me give you a quick lowdown on what the Ramayana is. So, the majority of Ramayana is a story of how Rama, the main character, his wife, Mother Sita, and Lakshmana, his brother, all are exiled into a forest, and then they are Mother Sita is uh, abducted, kidnapped by a demon, and then they're going and trying to find Mother Sita. Now, give me one moment. I'm going to try and get my face off the screen. I don't want to see myself. when I'm telling the story. I want to see all of your faces. Okay, perfect. Now I got that sorted. So that's the lowdown on the Ramayana. They go on this journey to find Mother Sita, who's kidnapped. Okay, so this is a story that I've grown up with throughout. All like my grandmother would tell me the story, my great grandmother would tell me the story. It's been one of my favorite stories. One of the reasons that I love this character Hanuman in the story is because I want to be like Hanuman. He's like my biggest inspiration. Some people like Superman and Spider-Man, but Hanumanji is my superhero. I love him. Now he has a broken jaw. I have one too. You see? Can you see that? Yeah. His dad is Vayu, the wind god. I'm a Geminian, and Gemini is an air sign. So you see the connection. Then my best friend would usually tell me growing up, whenever I was mad, apparently I had my lips like pursed like that and I looked like Hanumanji. And so Hanumanji is all that I want to be. He's like my invisible friend. I love him. I absolutely love him. One particular story that I absolutely love of Hanumanji is this story of how, when he was little, he went all the way up into the sky, heading towards the sun, because he thought the sun was a juicy, yummy mango. He wanted to eat it up. He shoots straight for the sun, and just before he got to the sun, before he could take one juicy bite of the sun, Indra, the god of lightning, comes and shoots a lightning bolt at him. And his jaw is hit. And that's how he has a broken jaw. He falls onto the ground with a thud. His father gets super furious, very angry. Father is the wind god. He sucks up all of the wind from the earth, takes all the oxygen from earth, demands that his son is taken care of. And so all the gods get really, really, really afraid that they all come together. They give him all of the powers that they can. The lightning and thunder god give him a whole weapon that's made out of lightning. The goddess of knowledge, a super sharp intellect, so that he can be able to grasp anything that he wants to learn. The sun god gives him the powers to shine bright in whatever he does. And so he had every power that you can think of. He was the most powerful, except there was a catch. He would never remember of his powers when he most needed it. That's a big catch, huh? So now in the Ramayana, there is this one point. Mother Sita is kidnapped. The whole monkey army is standing by the beach in the south of India. Across the sea, the ocean, across on the other side in Lanka is Mother Sita, kidnapped in the hands of the demon Ravana. Sri Rama is standing there with his brother, the rest of the army, Jambavan, the wise old bear. All of them are standing there, wondering how they were going to even their calculations of Mother Sita being across the ocean. Slowly, every head in the Vanara or the monkey army turned towards Hanuman. And at that moment, Hanuman sat crouched with his shoulder, the sparkle in his eyes dimmed. He's sitting between boulders. He's got tears welling up in his eyes. He is down in the dumps. I can't do it. I really cannot do it. I cannot cross the ocean. Who do you think? How do you think I can do it? I can't go across the ocean. And for Mother Sita, what am I going to do if I see Mother Sita? I can't. It was that moment when Jambavan, the wise bear, set his soft paw on Hanumanji's shoulder and said, "Hey, you have the powers bestowed on you by every single god there is. If you can't do it for your most favorite Sri Rama, there's nobody else who can. You're the one to do it." And with every single word that Jambavan uttered, Hanumanji's eyes sparkled, his body grew bigger, his chest swelled up, his feet grew in size. He didn't just double in size, he tripled in size. He was so tall, he was so huge that the army by the beach looked like tiny ants. Hanuman just took one.
I am so sorry. It looks like we have a bad connection here, so we've got some internet problems. Uh, so, so
I'm so
when
sorry.
you're done, okay, all right,
Oh no.
okay.
This is the moment. Hanumanji actually, it was so powerful that Hanumanji did that the internet decided to shocked as well, I guess. So Hanumanji takes one deep breath, one stretch of his big giant leg, and with one soft thud, he was now on Lanka. He turned around, looked at Jambavan, and smiled. Now, this is October 31st, and I am sitting in La Quinta Inn. My grandmother is visiting me for the very first time in the US, all the way from India. She was 80 years old then. She's now 84. She is sitting behind in the on the bed. I'm sitting at my desk, my shoulders slumped. My eyes are welling up with tears. I'm furiously typing on my laptop. My legs are shaking with nervousness. It was 2 a.m. in the morning. We had just missed our flight to New York from Tennessee. Had my big literature review assignment due in just a mere 6 hours. Something that I cannot possibly finish in 6 hours. As I'm sitting there in front of my laptop, my grandmother comes over to me and says, "Hey, do you remember the Hanumanji story that I always tell you?" And it all came flooding in. I just knew I had to push through. I turned in the assignment, I got it back, I got my grades. And in my teacher's note on my assignment was that I had typed in my whole assignment single spaced, which means that I had actually written double the amount that I was supposed to write. And I couldn't help but think of how I could not have possibly done it without my grandmother reminding me, just like how Jambavan, the wise bear, was there to remind Hanumanji. I had my grandmother reminding me of the powers, the infinite potential that I too had.
That is so wonderful, Winnie. Thank you so much for reminding us of our powers. Glad you have a grandmother who can do that. We all need her. All right. Thank you very much. And our next teller is Betsy Mosier. And Betsy fell in love with storytelling about 40 years ago. A teller told her, it doesn't matter how old you get, how fat you get, how ugly you get, you can still be a storyteller. And that sounded like job security to Betsy. So, so um, she has a very cute story about telling at church. And she was telling a really heartfelt story when someone came up and tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Wrap it up. Santa's here. You just got to." So she says, "Yes, storytellers, you just got to roll with it." Her wonderful story tonight is Christmas Eve at the Texaco station. Here's Betsy.
Old Ben leaned back in his chair, his feet up on his scarred old desk, and he watched the snow falling. It had been coming down for hours and hours, and didn't much matter. It was Christmas Eve, but Christmas Eve to old Ben was pretty much like any other day. It was quiet with the weather and Christmas Eve and that new interstate that went around the town. Well, old Ben hadn't talked to anybody all day. And as it got deeper and darker and the snow continued to fall, he was startled when the door to the Texaco station opened. And he looked up and there was a stranger. Might have been homeless. He might have been old, he might have been young, but he certainly looked cold and down on his luck. And old Ben said, "Come in." And the stranger said, I see that you look busy. You look I'm interrupting. I'll just go." And he turned to leave out the door. And Ben said, "No, no, you're not going anywhere till you sit down in that oak chair over there by the heater and get warm. And let me get you something to eat." And Ben reached around to the corner of his desk and grabbed a big old thermos and unscrewed the top and handed it to the stranger and handed him a spoon. He said, "It's not much, homemade beef stew, but I think it's pretty good, and it's hot and it's filling. And when you're done with that, well, there's a fresh pot of coffee over by the register. I make a mean cup of coffee." Well, the stranger sat and Ben was going to say something to him when he heard outside, well, they used to have bells that would ding as you drove your car across the line, and he heard that ding ding out by the pump, and he headed out the door. And as he did, a young man got out of the car. Mister, I need your help. I need your help. My wife, she's in labor. And well, look at my car. It's not going anywhere. It's not going any farther." And Ben walked over to the car and he lifted the hood of this old Chevy, and his face was enveloped by steam. And when that steam cleared, Ben shook his head. Looked to him like maybe the engine block was cracked. And if that was the case, that car wasn't going any farther. "But mister, I need help," said the young man. And Ben reached into the pocket of his jeans and he pulled out the keys to his truck. And he walked back to the service garage and opened the door up and climbed in his truck and started it up, and it started right away. And then he cranked up the heater and he backed it up to where that young man and his pregnant wife waited. Well, Ben helped the expectant father to get the young woman into his truck. And he said, "Not much to look at, but the heater works great. And the hospital, it's only down the highway another 10 or 15 miles. You'll make it." And the young man called out, "Thank you," and drove away into the receding dusk with his wife. Well, Ben walked back into the Texaco station and he said, "Oh, this truck's not much, but it's got new snow tires and it's got a heater that works and it'll." And then he realized he was talking to himself. That stranger, he wasn't sitting there, but there on the counter was that empty thermos and an empty coffee cup. And Ben shrugged his shoulders and he thought, well, I don't have any customers, nothing else to do before closing time. So he went back out and he started up that old car that the couple had left behind. And surprisingly, it did start up, and Ben drove it back to the service bay. And he opened up the hood again and he looked. And now that it had cooled a little bit, he could see that the engine block wasn't cracked. And as he poked around looking at everything, he realized it was a broken radiator hose. Oh, shoot, I can fix that, Ben thought to himself. And he got busy, replaced the hose, and then he looked at the tires on that old car and thought, there's no way those tires will get that couple through the winter. And so he uncovered his wife's old Cadillac that was sitting in the service bay. She was gone. She didn't need it, and he'd never drive it again. So he took off those snow tires and he put them on that young couple's car. And just as he was finishing, he was tightening the lug nut, the lug bolts, and ready to close up. And he heard shots ring out. And he ran out to the street. And there was a police car there. It had jumped the curb. And outside of the driver's door was a young policeman who'd been shot in his left shoulder. Well, Ben didn't stop to think. He rushed over and he helped that young policeman up, and he got him into the Texaco station office, and he stretched him out on a couch. And that's when his old army training, his medic training kicked in, and he thought, I've got to stop the bleeding. He grabbed some clean towels that had been left by the service people that morning and grabbed a roll of duct tape and went to work. And he told the young officer, it looks to me, it looks like that bullet went clear through. If we can stop the bleeding, I think you'll probably be okay. But just in case, well, I'm going to go call for an ambulance. And with that, he went to the phone and he picked up the old-fashioned receiver, but the line was dead. Well, there's nothing to do but go out to your squad car, and I'll see if I can't get that squawk box you got in there. I'll see if I can't call somebody on that radio. And when he went out to the squad car, well, there'd been 2 shots that night. One went through the shoulder of the young policeman, and the other went straight through the radio. Nothing to do but go back in, and he started to pour the officer a cup of coffee. And the officer said, no. And he said, yes, you need something hot. You need liquid. You're going to drink this. And he found an old blanket and he threw it over the young man's lap. And it wasn't long before he heard the sirens. And soon there was a squad car and a ambulance there, and 2 cops rushed in with their guns drawn. And they saw their friend, their fellow officer, on the couch. Johnny, are you okay? What happened? And John sat up and said, somebody shot me. But he was so scared, he dropped his gun and ran off into the night. I don't know where he is now. Well, that was odd, because in the Texaco station sat a young man who'd burst in not 5 minutes earlier with his gun drawn and said, give me your money, old man, all of the money. And old Ben had said, no, put the gun away. You don't need it. Here. And he reached into his pocket and he handed it to the young man. He said, violence isn't going to solve anything. And the young man, why, his face crumpled and he started to cry, and he crumbled to the floor saying, I'm not even good at this. I'm not even good at robbing, but it's Christmas Eve. I've lost my job. I can't pay my rent. My car was repossessed last week. I have nothing. And old Ben said, it's just a small problem, a blip. We can help. And that's when the 2 officers burst into the room. And the first thing they did is they talked to their officer friend, Johnny, and then they looked at the young man and said, what are you doing here? Are you involved in this? And the officer who'd been shot sat up and said, no, The guy who shot me, he ran off. And with that, they looked at Ben, and Ben said, no, this is just a young man down on his luck. I hired him this morning. And with that, the officers and the ambulance drivers and the ambulance paramedics came in and helped Johnny onto a gurney and took him away to the hospital. And the young man, why, he looked at Ben as he sat there and he said, I don't understand. I don't understand why. Why didn't he tell the police officers that it was me that shot him? And old Ben said, you got lucky tonight, kid. You got real lucky. And with that, Ben went into his office and he came back with a box. And he opened the box, and in it was a small ring box, which he opened and handed to the young man. Take this home to your wife for Christmas. And the young man looked, and it was the prettiest diamond ring he ever seen. Oh, no, this must mean something to you. And old Ben said, it was my wife's. She said it'd come in handy someday, and I think it is. But it means something special. And Ben said, no, I have my memories. You take the ring. And then he dug around in the box some more, and he pulled out a toy truck and a toy airplane and a toy car. And he said, the oil company left these for me for samples to sell. But you take these home to your little boy tonight. And the young man, he started to cry again. And he reached into his pocket and he pulled out that $150 that Ben had given him and tried to hand it back. And Ben looked at him and said, but what are you going to buy Christmas dinner with? No, you keep that. You take the toys, you take the ring and the money, and you go home to your family. Well, the boy turned to leave, and he looked back at old Ben, and he said, to that job offer, the one you said you told the officers you hired me this morning, is that still good? If it is, I'll be here tomorrow morning. And old Ben just smiled and said, nope, I'm closed on Christmas Day, but I'll see you first thing on the 26th. And with that, the young man left with his treasures. And when Ben turned around to close up the station, he was surprised because there was the stranger again, that man who wasn't young, he wasn't old, but he looked desperate and down on his luck. And Ben said, I thought you left. And the stranger said, no, Ben, I've been here the whole time. Ben, you say you don't keep Christmas. Why is that? And Ben said, well, after my wife died, well, there didn't seem much point in putting up a tree and baking cookies and hanging lights. It just didn't seem important. And the stranger said, Ben, you fed me and warmed me when I needed it most. You helped that young boy, and you helped that policeman, and you helped that couple. That couple is at the hospital now, and the wife, she's giving birth to a baby girl. And that little girl will grow up to be a great heart surgeon someday, and she will save many, many, many lives. And that policeman, why, next year there'll be a whiteout on the interstate, and that policeman will be on duty, and he will save 19 people in the cold and the snow. And that young man you hired him, well, he's going to make you a very rich man, and he won't keep any of it for himself. Ben, you keep Christmas as well as anyone. Well, with that, the stranger in the torn leather jacket and the dirty jeans, well, those clothes began to change. And soon that stranger was wearing a glowing white robe, and the room was filled with a golden light. And he looked at Ben and he said, I got to get going. There's a big celebration at home tonight. I got to go home, Ben. It's my birthday. And with that, Ben fell to his knees and said, Happy birthday, Lord. Christmas at the Texaco station.
Thank you so much, Betsy. Oh, Santa Claus has many names, including Ben. Wonderful story. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. All right. So our next teller is Anne Shimojima. She's been a storyteller for 40 years, a new voice teller at the National Storytelling Festival in 2017, a teller in residence at the International Story Center. Her CD, Sakura Tales, Stories from Japan, won a Storytelling World Resource Honor Award in 2019. And her signature piece, Hidden Memory, an American World War II story, describes her Japanese-American family's experience in World War II. And in 2024, she received the Circle of Excellence Oracle Award from the National Storytelling Network. This story that Anne is going to tell tonight is based on a Japanese legend from the late 1800s. The story tells about an old man who saved the people of his village from destruction. And now from Anne Shimojima, The Wave.
Hello, everybody. Greetings from Chicago. This story is adapted from a legend that was collected by Lafcadio Hearn and is from his book Gleanings in Buddha Fields, published in 1897. Once in Japan, a long time ago, there was a small village by the sea. Just 90 thatched houses nestled at the base of a mountain. The people there grew rice, and you could see the rice fields all around and even going up the mountain like green terrace steps. Above the people's rice fields was a large temple where they would worship, and above the temple the largest house in the village. It belonged to an old man named Gohei Hamaguchi. Hamaguchi-san lived there with his grandson Tada. He was the wealthiest of all the villagers and the head man of the village. He was so beloved. The people called him Oji-san, which means grandfather. He was very wise. They would go to him with their problems, and he would help with advice and sometimes money. It was on a fall day. Oji-san was standing on the veranda of his house. From that place, he could look all the way down the mountain and see the entire village. First, his own rice fields. The rice had been cut and gathered into stacks at the end of every row. It had been a good harvest, such a good harvest that people were planning to celebrate that night with a festival. He could see the temple with the banners and the lanterns hanging in readiness for the celebration. He could see the people's rice fields, their houses, the beach, and finally the sea. The air was warm and strangely heavy. It was earthquake weather. And as he stood there on the veranda, he began to feel the slow shaking of an earthquake. Now, he was not alarmed. They lived through several earthquakes every year, but this one seemed different. The shaking started deep, deep below the surface of the earth. The earth shook and stilled. And then Oji-san looked out at the water of the ocean, and he saw something he'd never seen before. The water was moving in the wrong direction. The water was pulling away from the land. It looked like the water was running away from the land. The people in the village were beginning to notice this strange sight. They were gathering on the beach, talking to each other, pointing out to the water. No one had ever seen this before. No one knew what it meant. But Oji-san, standing there, began to remember when he was a little boy, his grandfather telling him of the very same thing happening when he was a little boy. And Oji-san knew what was to come. It was great danger, but there was no time to run all the way down the mountain to warn the people. There was no time even to get to the temple to ask the priest to ring the bell. He turned to his grandson, Tada. He said, "Light me a torch." The boy obeyed immediately, bringing a lit pine torch. Oji-san took the torch and ran down to the edge of his rice field. He hesitated for only a moment, looking at all his work for the past year, all his wealth. And then he raised the torch and lit the first rice stack. Immediately it burst into flame, the black smoke billowing into the air. He did not hesitate. He ran to the next row and lit that stack and ran to the third row. Tata ran beside him, crying, Ji-chan, what are you doing? What are you doing? The old man did not answer, just kept lighting stack after stack, row after row. Tata ran back to the house weeping. He thought his grandfather had gone crazy. Finally, the old man had lit the last stack. He dropped his torch, went back to his veranda, and he waited. It was a priest at the temple who first saw the black smoke rising. Ah, he thought, Oji-san's rice fields are burning and we must help. And he began to ring the bell over and over and over until finally the people who were still standing on the beach, still pointing out to the water, which was still pulling away from the land. At last the people turned and looked up the mountain and saw the black smoke rising. Ah, Oji-san's rice fields are burning, we must help. And they began to run up the side of the mountain, every man, woman, and child, for the old man was well loved. The young men and women reached him first. Water, they said, where's the water? We'll help you put out the fire. But he said, no, let the fields burn. What? Let the fields burn? But why? There is great danger, he said. Everyone must come, everyone. And gradually they did all come, the children running up, the young mothers with the babies upon their backs, and finally the old people leaning upon their canes. And when he saw that everyone was there, he said, yes, I lit my rice fields. Look to the sea. And everyone turned and looked at the water, still pulling away from the land. And then, before their unbelieving eyes, the water rose up into a solid wall of water, high, higher, impossibly high, and that wall of water began to rush towards the shore, tsunami, the great wave, and that wall of water crashed upon the beach, sending the wood from their houses flying, and then pulled back and rose up again into another wall of water that rushed to the shore and crashed upon the beach 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, but each time growing weaker and weaker, until finally the water settled itself back in its ocean bed, dark and uneasy. And the people stared at the wreckage of their houses, at the beach where only moments before they had been standing. That, said Oji-san, that is why I burnt my rice fields. And one by one the people turned, and one by one they sank to their knees and bowed to the old man who stood before them, once the wealthiest of them all, now a poor man, but he had saved 400 lives. Come, he said, my house still stands, and the temple too. There is room for many. Come. And he turned, and he led the way.
Oh, and thank you so much for that inspirational story. You told it just wonderfully. It was mesmerizing. Thank you so much for inspiring us tonight. Okay, so here's our next teller. It's Ron Chick. And Ron Chick learned in his 35 years as a special education teacher that a vivid, relatable story is often the best way to present a new idea to a young mind. Schools require you to retire by a certain year, but Ron knew that you cannot retire a devoted storyteller, and we are so lucky. Here he is. Ron knows that every time you tell a story, you forge a link between you and the audience that takes it to heart. The story you hear connects you all the way back to the first person who was inspired to share the tale within his heart. And as long as that story is told, the links between everyone who hears it and everyone who has shared it form an unbroken chain. Ron, so let's hear this unbroken chain. Let's keep the chain going with the legend of Bernardo's gold. an inspiring season of joy tale. Thank you, Ron.
Hello, everyone. This book is from The Long Christmas, a book of tales collected by Mayhill Arbuthnot, and has most of my Christmas stories in it. In the hills above Cumbria, there lived a landholder and farmer. He had lived there for a long time. His life was simple. At the right times, he went down to Cumbria and worshipped at the Roman temples. And at the right times, he did the things that was required of him. But these things were not important to him. What he mostly thought about was the land that had been his father's father's father. That was what was important in his mind. His wife and children had died in a fever a few years before, and so he was not doing as much as he had once done. He didn't need as much, but he had his animals, he had his crops, and he took care of things himself. One year in the fall, just after he had had some harvest people up, he was standing at the edge of his hillside looking down to where the valleys were, the cities were, and he saw someone coming up the path. It was getting dark, but it looked to him as if this person was staggering somewhat. Of course, he hurried down and found a man, somewhat oddly dressed, who was clearly very ill and shivering. He threw his own cloak around him and helped him up the hill, took him into his house, and began to nurse him back to health. It took some time. Over the course of that fall and winter, the two of them got to know each other quite well. The man said he was traveling to tell people of a new religion that had risen across the Roman Empire. A religion based on trust and taking care of your neighbors and loving God. He told him stories of this man, Jesus of Nazareth, and the things that he had done. He told him about a woman he had met at a well. He told him about his son who wasted his father's wealth and yet was welcomed back in love. He told tale after tale after tale of this man, Jesus of Nazareth. But Bernardo's favorite tales were the ones of the Christmas season. He was amazed at the stories of how the animals in the stable had laid quietly and watched, and people had come and the celebrations had been. And he became convinced that if he could go to Bethlehem and be there at midnight on Christmas Eve, he might see that same miracle where the ox and the ass and the sheep and the goats all worshiped the Christ child. And so, after his friend Diego had left, he went back to work, much harder than he had done in recent years. He raised more crops. He gathered more sheep. He purchased more goats, and his wealth grew. For he had been told when he went down to Cambria that it would take 9 pieces of gold to be in Bethlehem, 3 for the journey there, 3 for the journey back, and 3 to offer as a gift to the Christ child. Working for that much gold took him some time, but eventually the gold was acquired, and he began to plan for the journey. It would take at least a month, maybe a month and a half. He took the animals to friends and said, "Keep them while I'm away." He looked out at the fields and thought, "They'll keep until spring." And he was all prepared to start on his journey the next day. He went out to his observation point where he often stood at the end of a day, and saw someone moving up the trail again, a very small someone, and not seemingly knowing what they were doing. He went down the path a ways and found a child, maybe 8, maybe a little younger, a little older, but he had clearly been abused greatly. He thought, what could a child possibly do to deserve this kind of treatment? And he picked the child up and took him back up to his place and began to bandage his wounds and feed him and take care of him. They spoke a few words in common. He realized that this was a runaway slave, but he thought, such a small child. Hey, why can't I take him back down to slavery? No one will come for him here. And so he nursed him back to health, and the child proved helpful and kind. But later that year, he looked down the path again and saw striding toward him a Roman soldier. He came looking for the escaped slave. Can you not say that you found his bones? I have 9 pieces of gold I can give you if you will do this. What soldier would turn that down? He took the gold and headed back down to report to the owner that the slave had died. It will be better. Now I have a son who can inherit my land, and I can teach him everything he needs to know. And with 2 of us working, raising 9 more gold coins should not take as long. And so the plan was made. And every night he told stories he remembered, from the life of Jesus. And every night the boy asked questions, and some of them he knew not answers for. But the faith grew stronger. Finally, gold was acquired again, and the boy was enough older now that he could handle the things that had to be done in the winter in the farmlands. And Bernardo again prepared to leave. It was the morning he was actually going to head down when up the trail came not one person, but a whole cavalcade of people. And they were led by a man in priestly robes. The man stopped in front of Diego's home and said, "Hey, hello. We have come to establish a church here. There is a story that the great Diego, once met a man here who helped him through a tough time, and he wanted to have a church built here. Do you know who that would be?" Well, of course, Bernardo said, that was me. And a church here would be a good thing. Good. We will have to buy some land and raise some funds, but we will build a great church here. You need not buy land. I have land enough to give you a place to build our church, and I shall help with doing so. Then most we need to do is make our plans and consecrate the ground and begin raising money. For it takes a great deal of money to build a brand new church. With that, Bernardo reached for his leather pouch and said, I have this. I will help the Christ child build his church. And so it was done. He was not a young man now, but he worked hard. He worked steadily. He helped them with managing their lands. He helped them with their animals. He had a gift for the sheep and the goats. They followed him whenever they could. And the years went by. Oh, he loved the services. He loved the sermons. He loved the Bible lessons. But what bothered him most is that they spent so much time on the death and crucifixion and resurrection and hardly mentioned anything at Christmas except at midwinter. Teach these things, of course, for they are necessary, but you're leaving out the joy that makes it all worthwhile, the love that he showed that night. But of course, he was just an old, ignorant man, and nobody paid much attention to his ramblings. Years went by. He was now too frail to work in the fields, but they let him tend to the sheep and the goats and the other barn creatures, and they seemed to do quite well. Christmas came, Christmas Eve, and of course, everyone came into the church, and everyone worshiped and sang, and the midnight mass concluded, and everyone but Bernardo went to their quarters to sleep until morning. But he did not feel like sleeping that night. He sat for a while in the church, staring at the window and the cross. And And then he went out to the barn. He said to the animals, I will never go to Bethlehem now. But perhaps you and I can worship the Christ child this night. And he led some of the animals with him into the church. And he went forward and kneeled at the altar. And the animals lay down quietly, watching. A beam of sunlight came through the window. And he moonlight. And he thought, what is this? And he realized it was illuminating the face of Christ in the window. His hand went to his side where his gold would have been years before, and then he remembered he had donated it long ago. But a voice said, it was but lent, Bernardo. You have been a good man. And an angel set the purse down. When it was time for morning mass, and the priests and acolytes began to come in, they were astounded, for there in the church, sitting perfectly still and quiet, were sheep and goats and ox and ass, and lying on the floor up at the front of the altar was Bernardo, with a look of astonishment and joy on his dead face. They came forward and looked, and there in his hand was a leather purse. The priest opened it up and poured out 9 gold coins. The sacrist said, it was a gift of like this that was given to the church to get it started. And here it is again. And the priest said, my brothers and sisters, we have truly seen a miracle. For the rest of that year, those that had the skills to do so carved and made and painted and created. And the next year, at midwinters, at Christmas time, placed inside the church was a manger and a stable and carved axes and knitting wise men and all the things that we now call a creche or nativity. That was the first such thing ever placed in a Christian church. And if you see one anywhere this night or anywhere this season, remember, this was the gift of a truly great Christian man. The legend of Bernardo's gold.
Thank you so much, Ron. What an inspirational story that was. And it's fabulous. We have another hero with starts with the letter B, Bernardo. Thanks for inspiring us. And our next teller is a hero who his name starts with the letter B. It's Ben Tucker. Ben is a storyteller, podcaster, and he's an author. He specializes in historical stories, folk tales, and fairy tales. He's on the board of directors for Storytelling Association of California. He lives in Berkeley, California. And he wants to ask you this question. What was Christmas like for America's enslaved people? So let's enter into Christmas through the eyes of the enslaved. Ben Tucker.
Ben, could you unmute yourself?
Good evening, everyone. So great to be part of this great storytelling cast. I want to tell you a story about my grandfather. I was very, very close to my grandfather, and he was born 10 years after slavery was abolished. 10 years. Now, his father was born into slavery, and he only lived a very brief period of time after that. But my grandfather would sit at his knees and he learned stories from him. And my grandfather was a great, great storyteller. And I said, Grandpa, tell me about what your father told you what slavery was all about. And he said that the best time for slaves on the plantation was Christmas. And I said, Christmas? But how could slaves really celebrate Christmas when they didn't have anything? They couldn't give gifts. They couldn't receive gifts. They didn't even own their bodies. And he said, well, son, sit down here and I'm going to tell you what my daddy told me about slavery. He said that slavery was the best of the worst times in a slave's life because their burden was lightened just a little bit. And he said that was because all the crops were in, the coffers were filled, and people on the plantation, from the plantation owner to the mean old overseer, they let their guards down. And the people who were enslaved did not have to slave from can't see in the morning to can't see at night. And they were able to get together during that Christmas season and entertain themselves as best as they could. I said, well, what kind of entertainment could a slave possibly have, Grandpa? And he said, well, I'll tell you, son. He said, one of the things that they did was they told stories. They played games. They had dancing. There were musicians. And he said it was also a time for romance. Many of them got married, but they didn't get married in the traditional sense because slaves couldn't legally marry. They did something what they call jumping the broom, and they were married and formed a family that way. And I said, wow, that's amazing. I said, but did they have toys? He said, oh, yeah. The slaves, they weren't all slaving picking cotton. He says some of them were craftsmen and women. The women were able to knit. They made quilts. Other men on the plantation, they were carpenters and they made all kind of wooden toys for the kids. They were blacksmiths. But he said that was one aspect of Christmas for the slaves. He said, but another aspect of Christmas for the slaves was the run to freedom, to follow the North Star to the promised land of freedom. And he said the way that they were able to do that is because the paddy rollers, those were the slave catchers, and the overseers, they spent their time drinking moonshine, eating themselves full, and having a good old good time. So it was a perfect time to plot their escape north. And he said, boy, you ever heard of Harriet Tubman? I said, yeah, we heard about her in school. He said, well, let me tell you, Harriet Tubman was one of the greatest abolitionists in the world, in the United States. And she had three brothers who were on a plantation in Louisiana. And she got word that they were going to be sold down the river into New Orleans, which was basically a death sentence to work in the sugarcane fields. And they were granted a leave to go visit their relatives on Christmas Eve. And they were supposed to return back to the plantation on the 26th. So when Harriet learned about that, she sent word through the Underground Railroad and said, meet me at this particular spot in this particular space. Do not go and have dinner with your family. And with that, they reported to Harriet, and they were whisked off to freedom, to Philadelphia. And so many slaves made their escape because there was an opportune time when the slave holders was making merry during the Christmas holiday season. But then there were other slaves who were not just willing to escape to freedom, they were rebellious slaves. They were angry slaves. They hated the system of slavery. They hated how their people were treated, and they chose violence. They chose to be the ones who burned down old master's farm and burned down the plantation, and they fought. They fought because they wanted to smash that evil institution. Well, needless to say, they were outgunned, they were outmanned, but they breathed fear into the hearts of the enslaver. And then there were those who learned about the birth of Christ. They learned about what Christmas was all about. It was about the birth of Christ. And in Christ, in Jesus Christ, they saw someone not unlike themselves. They saw someone who was born in a manger, a barn, which was very close to the shacks that they lived in and they gave birth to their kids to in the slave quarters. They also saw someone who was hated. His people were hated. They were scorned. They were bonded into slavery, just as they were. And so Jesus Christ, for them, was a sense of hope, a sense of inspiration. And out of that hope came the solid rock belief in redemption. And they were able to pull together a spirituality that lives on to this day, because the strongest institution for the African American community has been, all the way up through this time, the church. And out of the church and out of the story of the Christ child came the Negro spirituals, the songs of freedom, the songs of hope, the songs of inspiration. And he said to me, this is what allowed our people to survive that evil institution. It was the way that they found out how to make a way out of no way, how to make something out of nothing. And he said, son, I want you to always remember what your ancestors, those enslaved ones, went through. They never gave up. They never gave out, so that you could do the good work and to make sure that we never, ever go back into bondage again. And you have to fight, because people will always try to set you back. But just keep in mind that story of the Christ child and how he made it through. And with that, he would sit back and he would sing. Beautiful voice he had, deep bass. And he said, I want you to remember this song, son. Oh, oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. That was what Christmas was like for slaves back in the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. That's it's just an inspiring story, and we should take that inspiration that lifting the burden just a little bit makes a huge difference. Thank you. And thank you for that story about redemption. Our next teller is actually going to give us another story of redemption. Catherine Bonin is a member of San Diego Storytellers Association. She's a retired sales executive and ordained minister, and she speaks, does ceremonies, teaches classes. She uses story in her teaching, preaching, and celebration services. And she says every religion, spiritual tradition, and philosophy has stories of redemption. She's going to tell a story called Carl's Garden. It's a more modern day version teaching the value of redemption. Here's Catherine Bonin.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. So for 70 years, Carl walked the neighborhood in an inner city home area where he and his wife Elsa purchased their very first home when they were just married. They raised their family there, 5 boys, and they would sit on the front porch and the children would play on the grass and ride their bikes in the street. And the neighborhood was a thriving, loving neighborhood, a wonderful community. They actually lived right across the street from the community church. So they spent their Sundays there and they really enjoyed the neighborhood and all of the people that they shared their life with. Well, as often happens in urban communities, the neighborhood started going downhill. People started leaving. A lot of the homes started getting into disarray, but Carl and Elsa continued to walk every night after dinner and talk about their day, talk about the neighborhood, notice the houses that were changing, all the changes that were happening in the neighborhood. Some of the houses were boarded up, and some of the houses would start getting fences around them and bars on the window, and graffiti started showing up on those vacant homes. The neighborhood really changed. It was starting to be a little bit dangerous. And but still, Carl and Elsa would walk every night after dinner around the neighborhood, and they started to sit in the park right behind the church where there was a little garden. And they would always talk about, they'd end their walks and talk about their day and what was happening in the neighborhood on a bench in that park right in front of that beautiful garden. Well, soon the church closed too, and it was boarded up. And then soon Elsa got very sick. They would still walk as much as they could. And then Elsa passed away. Well, Carl, in his grief, started spending more and more time in that garden in the park behind the church. And to ease his grief, he started to pull weeds and try to clean that area up a little bit, make it more of a garden like it had been before when the church was open and the neighborhood people were enjoying it. One day, he was sitting on that bench looking at the work and the big pile of weeds that he had pulled, and a real estate agent and the pastor came by to look at the church. And they were talking inside the church, and then the pastor came over and sat next to Carl on that bench. And he told Carl that he was going to reopen the church. Well, Carl was thrilled. And he told the pastor how he had been for about 15 years coming every day, sitting there pulling weeds. It was a way that he was able to experience the joy that he had experienced there when the church was open. That he had wonderful, fond memories of his time with his wife Elsa and his children there. And he prayed every day that the neighborhood would be revived. And he hoped that that church opening up again would help to revive the neighborhood. Well, the pastor, of course, was thrilled that he had someone who was willing to work in the park and in the garden and help bring that church alive again. So the church opened up, and Carl was the first one there every Sunday morning. And every day, Carl spent more and more time in that park, making more and more of it a garden. Well, the pastor wanted to have a shelter there for the homeless, and he wanted to feed the hungry. So Carl started planting fruit trees and vegetables and beautiful flowers that they would put on the altar on Sunday mornings. And Carl took great pride in that garden, and it grew and grew. And Carl just found so much joy in taking care of the garden. Well, one day he was out watering, and three young boys came up to him in the garden, and they pushed him down. And the tallest of the boys, that seemed to be the older and the leader of the group, grabbed the hose from Carl and started just squirting the water all around him. The other two were kicking Carl when he was on the ground. Now, Carl was in his 80s at this time, and the boys laughed at him and teased him, and then they took off and left him there on the ground. Well, Carl had a really hard time getting up, and he couldn't get up. He kept falling down, and the pastor saw from the window that Carl was on the ground. He wasn't sure what had happened, but he went out to go help Carl. And Carl told him what had happened, that these three thugs had come by and pushed him to the ground, that they were kicking him, and they were making fun of him, and they were obviously thugs. And he just hoped and prayed that they would find their way. And the pastor said, Carl, I don't know how you can be so kind to those boys, offering them water and forgiving them already. And Carl said, they'll find their way. God will help them, and they'll find their way. And about a week later, the three boys returned. And once again, they pushed Carl to the ground, and the older boy picked up the hose and was squirting Carl with the water, and they were teasing him and making fun of him and kicking him. And then they ran off. And this time the pastor saw them running away, and he ran out to go help Carl up. And Carl's legs were hurt pretty badly this time. So he set him on the bench, and they sat there and talked for a while. And once again, Carl talked about forgiving those boys. Well, a few days later, the three boys returned again, and Carl offered them water because he had seen that they had been running from something. Well, the boys pushed Carl down again, and this time they took his wallet and they took his gold watch that he had received from the railroad when he retired after 50 years of working on the railroad. They took his wallet, and they left him there on the ground. Well, this time the pastor wasn't there, so Carl laid there on the ground for quite a while, and he couldn't get up. And someone walked through the park and saw Carl there and helped him up. And they sat on the bench for a while and talked, and then the pastor arrived, and Carl told him what had happened. And that Sunday, the sermon was all about forgiveness. And it was about this story with Carl. Well, those boys didn't come back. And a few months passed, and Carl's legs healed, and he was back working in the garden every day. And he was raking up a pile of leaves because summer was over and fall was coming. The leaves were falling from the trees, and Carl tripped over a branch and fell face first into those leaves. Well, he heard something behind him, and so he turned around to look as he laid there on the ground, and it was the tallest, eldest of those three hooligans, his tormentors over the summer. And Carl prepared himself to be struck. He thought for sure this boy was going to hurt him. Instead, he reached out his tattooed and scarred hand and gave Carl a lift and helped him stand. He sat with him on the bench. He reached into his coat pocket and he took out a paper bag. And in that paper bag was Carl's belongings. And he said, "Here, I have something for you." And Carl said, "What is this?" And the boy said, "Well," he said, "I haven't been able to sleep since we took your wallet and your watch. And so I wanted to return them to you. You taught me something. As much as we hated you, you returned that hate with love, offering us water and forgiving us. And we heard about that sermon and how you forgave us for being so horrible to you. I wanted to bring this back to you as just a gesture." He said, "Even the money is there. Everything is there. And I'm sorry that we were so horrible to you." Well, and then he took off. Carl opened the bag. He took out his watch, put it on the bench beside him. He took out his wallet, and instead of looking for the money in the wallet, he looked for the picture of his beloved wife, Elsa. It was taken on their wedding day. It was his most prized possession. And as he looked at it, he smiled and his heart warmed as he saw his wife smiling back at him. Then he put the gold watch back on his wrist and he put the wallet in his back pocket. Well, Carl died a few months later, just 2 days after Christmas that year. And there was snow on the ground, feet and feet of snow on the ground, but so many people turned up for the memorial service. After the memorial, at the memorial, the pastor told everyone that they were going to have a dedication in the garden for Carl. He talked so much about how Carl was forgiving and how Carl worked so hard in that garden. 70 plus years, Carl dedicated his life to that neighborhood. And then pastor, as he was speaking, he looked towards the back of the church and he saw a tall man leaning against the back wall with his head down. And Carl had heard the pastor had heard the stories from Carl about those 3 boys, and he wondered if that tall man was one of those boys. Well, after the service, indeed, they all went into the garden and they dedicated that garden with a huge plaque, and they called it Carl's Garden. And the young boy was nowhere to be found. Well, after the snow melted and the ice melted and winter turned into spring, the pastor decided it was time to get someone to take care of the garden. So he put a sign up on the gate of the garden, "Help wanted, someone to take care of Carl's garden." And no one responded for a week, and then 2 weeks, and then one day there was a knock on the door. The pastor went and opened the door, and it was that same tall man. And the man had the poster in his hand, and he said, "I think this is my job, if you'll have me." And he sat down and told the pastor the story about how Carl had changed his life by responding to hate with love. And the pastor gave him the keys to the gardening shed and said, "If you want the job, it's yours. Honor Carl by taking care of this garden." And so for many years, that tall young man came every day to take care of Carl's garden. He revived the flowers and the vegetables and the fruit trees, and he took great care of the garden. And the neighborhood started to come to life again. And one day, the young man came into the pastor's office and he said, "Pastor, I'm very sorry, but I'm going to have to stop taking care of the garden. And I'll tell you why." He said, "Over the years, I've been serving here at the church and in taking care of Carl's garden." He said, "I went to school and I started a business and I met my beautiful wife. And yesterday, we had our first child. The baby's coming home on Saturday, and I need to be with my family, so I'm not going to have the time to take care of the garden." And the pastor said, "Oh, I understand. We'll find someone to do it. Don't worry, my son. We're very proud of the young man that you've become. But before you go, tell me, what did you decide to name your child?" And the young man said, "Carl. We named him Carl."
Thank you so much, Catherine. What a lovely story that was. And heroes everywhere. Thank you so much. All right. Our last teller is Janice Burt. Janice is an inspirational keynote speaker. She's also a court-certified Spanish interpreter, a voiceover artist, a yoga instructor, an actor, and an author. She's a 2 times TEDx speaker with topics such as kicking the people-pleasing habit and walking through 1 fear per year. Her purpose in life is to share hope and encouragement with others through the power of words and messy action. Her story is Miss America and the 3 Rings. A simpleton box, a clanking surprise, 3 gold rings reveal a story of timeless love, a grandmother's cherished legacy, and a father's selfless sacrifice. This heartfelt story reminds us of the power of words and the treasures we hold on to for those we love. Here it is, Janice Burt.
Clank, 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 clank. what in the world is in here? My dad had just handed me this little tin box for Christmas. And knowing my dad's financial situation, I just think it's some kind of a trinket from the dollar store. So I flippantly opened the lid and I looked down inside the box. And then I look up at my dad again. My eyes are as big as saucers, and look down again at the box. There are 3 diamond rings laying on the inside of this tin box. My dad just smiles at me and says, "Merry Christmas. Those belonged to your grandma." And I instantly start to cry. And I don't mean little tears, I mean big, fat tears, the kind that come from the bottom of your soul. Now, I'm crying for 2 reasons. The first is that my grandma was one of my favorite people in the entire universe. "Here she comes, Miss America," she would sing every time I walked into the room. My first memory of this is when I'm about 5 years old. And I remember slipping on her high-heeled shoes, and then I walked into the living room and I danced and I pranced around the room to "Here She Comes, Miss America." And with that simple song, I felt beautiful. I felt special. I felt seen, and I felt loved. My grandma didn't spend too many years with me. She died when I was just 16 years old of ovarian cancer. But now here I am, 25 years later, looking down at her beautiful rings. These rings that I could still vividly picture on her fingers as she would elegantly lift her hand up to her mouth to smoke her cigarette. My hands are shaking as I slip one of the rings out of the tin and onto my finger. And I start crying a little bit harder when I realize it fits me perfectly, almost as if my grandma had purchased these rings specifically with me in mind. Now, the second reason why I was crying is because my dad had held on to these rings for over 2 decades without telling anybody about them. And due to some questionable decisions in my dad's life, choices that he made, he didn't have very much to his name. As a matter of fact, all he really had was his very small Social Security check that would come in the mail once a month. I saw my dad go from living in a nice house to living in a low-income senior center. I saw him go from driving a car to taking public transportation. And I saw him go from having this beautiful set of white teeth to having none at all. This man could have easily taken these rings to a pawn shop to get some money to pay for some basic necessities that he had, but he didn't. He chose to hold on to them and give them to me, his only daughter, Miss America. Now, there are 2 very obvious takeaways from this story. The first is that words are powerful. The words that we say can absolutely shape and impact the way a person views themselves, how they show up in life. So may we be kind and uplifting and encouraging with our words, especially when we're talking to those children in our lives. And the second very obvious takeaway is that Diamonds truly are a girl's best friend.
That song's gonna be in my head, Janice. Diamonds are a girl's best friend. But let's remember also what you said, that words are powerful. Thank you so much for your story. All right. Thank you, everyone. We're going to invite our tellers back. And let's all give them a nice round of applause. So we have Janice, Catherine, Ron, and Ben, and Shimajima, and Betsy Mosier. Winnie had to put her little girl to bed, so she's not with us. Thank you. Let's give them all a wonderful round of applause. They're just fabulous. What a very nice night of stories, everyone. I'm very inspired. So let's go around and see what's up in the future for you. What's coming up next for you. So we'll start with Betsy.
Well, I don't have a lot coming up, but in March, I'm going back to Denton, Texas, and we'll be at the Tejas Storytelling Festival. And I get to be liaison to Cooper Braun. Those of you who've heard Cooper tell, I'm really excited. He's one of our featured tellers, one of 4 tellers. And don't know if I get to tell any stories, but I can keep my fingers crossed.
Wonderful. How exciting. And Anne, what's coming up?
Well, I do most of my storytelling here in Illinois, but in January, on January 8th, I will be on Zoom telling one story for the South Sound Story Guild. That's on January 8th. And South Sound is in the state of Washington.
Excellent. I'll be there. Thanks, Anne. Ron, what's up for you next?
Well, I've done a lot of storytelling at a lot of places this month earlier, but I have only one more event coming. On January 6th, normally, this year will be January 5th, I celebrate the 12th night, which is also Epiphany, which is also King's Day. I have a feast of stories. Betsy, you've been to one of these, I believe. I would be happy to invite any storyteller in the whole state of California who wants to come to 3645 Beechwood Place and share your stories and share hot smoked tri-tips, potatoes au gratin, water, hot cocoa, and a vast potluck of food. And we eat until we can't eat anymore, and we tell stories until the last story is told. The only request is that they be stories like these, stories appropriate to the end of the season of joy. I don't know how to put things in comments, but if somebody can put this down, put it for people if anybody's interested. My address is 3645 Beechwood, Beechwood Place, Riverside, California, 92506.
Wonderful. Thanks for the invitation, Ron. Wow, just for the food I'd come.
It's worth it, I promise.
All right, and Brother Ben, what's up for you?
In the month of January,